older brother. I'm guessing my brother would be about 6, and that's outside our home before any construction ever began. That was early winter, and the house was very poorly built, and you can see the boards around the edge here that my father put around and filled that with earth to help keep the house warmer inside. That was called banking. That was done a lot in those days. Have you ever heard me play like that? Okay, well, this is a picture after the construction began with the first Caterpillar I probably ever saw, or my brother ever saw. That's my young brother sitting on the seat, and a neighbor woman and myself and the man who operated the Caterpillar. It might be interesting to note that most of our clothes were homemade by our mother. This is a steamroller used to level a tarmac. I assume that this could be a road, or probably more likely it was a runway. This machine was brought from I don't know where, and it looks like it took 2 men to run it. It was fired with coal, and it was steam powered. This is a group of people, mostly men, except the 2 kids in the Caterpillar again. Now, there were probably more Caterpillars than one, but this is actually happening right in our farmyard. You can see some buildings over to the right-hand side. And most of the fellows there, I believe, are local farm men who would come to get jobs in construction. The fellow second from the right is my stepfather. This is my dad's tractor. It was a Twin City steel wheel tractor, and that's my brother and myself on it. School, and when we lived on the farm that was bought for the airfield, we were only about 3/4 of a mile away. And then when we moved after the airfield was being built, we had to walk 3 miles to the school. But you can see how few children went to that school at that point in time.
Marie Graham, September 28, 2000, at Jack and Marie Graham's house in Brandon, Manitoba. Please tell us your name.
Marie Graham.
And how old were you when the war started?
I was 9 years old.
Where were you at the time?
I was living with my parents on a farm near Dauphin, and my brother and my grandfather.
And so your family farmed
Yes.
a lot of land?
No, we had a quarter section. We were folk who had lived in Saskatchewan and had come to Manitoba a couple of years earlier because we'd been dried out. And my father bought a quarter section of land near Lake Dauphin.
So how did life for you change when the war started?
Well, right when the war started, it didn't mean a whole lot to me. I recall a neighbor coming to visit with my parents to talk about war and about the beginning of the war. He'd been in World War I, and my basic remembrance about that is that it was kind of somber, sober talk. And I didn't know a whole lot about war. And I had remembered hearing some things about bombing because I guess the Japanese war had gone on some time before that, and so I knew about bombing, and that was a kind of a scary thought to me, but it didn't seem to be an imminent danger because in my life up to that point I'd probably seen 2 airplanes. So that's...
Did you know any family sisters who had family members who went off to serve?
In World War II?
Yeah.
Oh, sure, yes. Mm-hmm.
So you could see some effects
Mhm.
happen in that people
Yeah.
were leaving home.
Mm-hmm. Not immediately. I think the ones that went immediately were the vets of World War I. They were the ones that signed up right away. It seemed, at least the ones that I knew. They went off.
So when did life really start to change for you, and what happened?
Well, I guess the changes really started to happen when my parents' farm was bought by the Department of Defense, I guess. And I don't know how that happened, because the family we lived wasn't in a family that talked a lot, or that business wasn't part of what children took part in. And the farm was bought, and all of a sudden, building was happening. They were going to build an airport on what was our farm and some other adjacent land. We were the best quarter of a section, and the Department of Defense bought a whole section of land, the southern half of which was mostly bush, and our half was cultivated, and part of the other half was cultivated. And the people began to arrive, people and machinery. And it was summertime. It must have been summer holidays, I think, because they came, and I can remember them bringing machinery. They brought caterpillars. I'd never seen a caterpillar before. They brought rubber-tired tractors. I'd never been up close to a rubber-tired tractor before, and steamrollers and all kinds of things. And I guess the big impact for me was people, because I think it's maybe difficult for people now to recognize the kind of isolation, social isolation, that was the norm for most people of that generation that lived in the country, because transportation wasn't what it is today. You have to remember that there was no rural electrification, that most of us didn't have telephones, that the radio got turned on only when we wanted to hear something special because it was run on a battery, that we would get a weekly newspaper and maybe 2 magazines in a month. There was no library nearby. Social interactions were much fewer. People lived farther away, and we worked hard, and most people were quite poor. This is not crying the blues. This is the end of, this is Depression times. People worked very hard to make a living. And where was I with the, how did it change? I guess I wanted to say something about what life was like, so that we know how it changes.
And how it affected you as a child, what your
Yes.
thoughts were.
Yeah, because of the social isolation, seeing all these people was quite amazing, really. There would be 20, 30 guys out there working, and with all this machinery and dust and fun, and we would go out and watch, and local farmers worked machinery for them. And then when they started to build the buildings, there were a lot of buildings had to be built. Anybody that's seen a training school will know that there were barracks and mess halls and you name it, everything they needed for this community of I don't know how many hundred people were there. And so...
Marie, where did they all stay as the building was going on?
I don't know.
And
My uncle stayed with us.
were you ever serving, was your mother ever serving them meals?
No, only our own family. Yeah, and I think most of the neighbor guys would be fed by their own families, yes. I don't remember whether they took lunches out to the fields or not. I know we kids would do errands for them, and I don't even remember what those errands were, but I can remember a guy fishing in his pocket and taking out a whole handful of change and giving it to us. I mean, this was a gold mine, you know. There weren't many kids around, and we were the kids that were hanging around there, and they treated us really nicely. We got to ride on some of the
So
machinery.
what happened to your buildings?
Well, I don't remember when it happened, and I can't even picture the removal, but I do know that our house was put on skids and taken to a location about 1.5 miles away, down on the south shore of Lake Dauphin, and it was added on to when it was set down on the ground again. We could afford to build onto this rather poor small house that we'd moved into when we came there, and that was a good thing, because there were 5 of us living in this little house, and it meant my brother and I had an upstairs bedroom to ourselves up in the loft area of the house, and my grandpa had a room to himself, and yeah, it was different. And my dad started to work for the railway, so that was different too. That meant money.
So
Yeah, I think so, although I don't know how my father would have felt about not being a farmer anymore, because he wasn't a man that talked. But he certainly got a job right away on the section, and then soon after that he got a job working in the roundhouse in Dauphin.
So do you have any idea how long it took to get the buildings up and get the runways built?
I'm not sure, Kathy, but it must have been several months, because I know that the carpentry went on all winter. I imagine they had to get the runways and the roads constructed that summer.
And did you know what was coming? Did you know what in particular they were going to use? That
No.
was going?
Oh, yes, I knew it was going to be an airport, but I had no idea what that meant. I mean, that was outside of our experience. No TV, you got to remember, you know, the pictures aren't there. So we didn't know. We waited and we watched. And yes, a lot of us were good watchers, and we learned a lot from watching. And another important thing was the school that we went to. We walked the full mile down the side of this airport every day to go to school, in the morning and the afternoon. And so we would see what went on all the time. And mind you, that particular mile we didn't walk very fast often, because there were lots of things to see. You know, because before that there weren't many things to see. Well, I shouldn't say that, you know, the rabbits and the weasels and whatever, but yeah.
So when did Air Force personnel start to arrive?
After the construction was finished, and I'm not exactly certain how long that would have been, probably into the next summer. And people came, and this was like the world coming to our door, because this was a Commonwealth Air Training school, and they were, of course, they were Canadians, and people from Great Britain. I don't know whether there were Irish people there, but I certainly remember Scottish accents and British accents, and we thought they all talked funny, you know. And there were people from New Zealand, Australia. I remember that very clearly. I'm not sure whether there were people from South Africa or India, but that's quite likely, but I don't remember. And we would meet these young men because when they had leave, they want to go to town, and we would never go to town without picking the fellas up on the side of the road. We'd just fill the car up full of guys, you know. There were no seatbelt laws in those days. And take them to town, or bring them home too. You know, whoever was standing on the road waiting, we'd take them back.
Did you invite them into your house? Were any of them ever over for meals?
No,
Holidays?
no, no.
So contact was more on the road and at the school. Did you ever go onto that land? And
No, that was not allowed. That was a military base, and if you went to the gate, to go in, you had to go to the gate. I don't remember whether we climbed over the fence into the end on the way to school or not. We might have. I'll tell you some more stories about why we might have later, but to go into the area where the buildings were themselves, there was a gate, and you went in. And one of the fellows that went in the gate every day was a farmer that lived down the road from us, a farmer from Denmark who raised pigs. And he had a round pig house, and he went up there with his horse and cart? I don't know, it was a wagon or a sledge. And he had a big barrel, and he'd bring the slops home every day and boil them for the pigs. So he went in every day.
I wonder if the servicemen thought it was appropriate food for the pigs.
Well, there's potato peelings and all that stuff, you know. Yeah.
So far that the food is actually good. They didn't have complaints.
I suspect that it was because most of them, many of them, maybe didn't have a whole lot of food before they joined up, because a lot of these young men would be people who had been riding the rails and looking for work. These were 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old guys, and when we went up, yesterday we went up to the museum to I don't know, to just get myself oriented to talk today. And we looked at at the memory book. And you know, the young men that were killed, they were boys. And I found that really hard.
So what kind of things did you see on your way to school?
Well, let me say first that this number 7 field was called Paulson, even though it was near Dauphin. It was called Paulson because there was a railway siding to the south of it. And it was a bombing and gunnery school. That meant that young men there, and it was men, not women, learned to shoot out of airplanes and learned to bomb. And the shooting part, they had to have a target, a moving target. Now, they may have done some gunnery training on the ground that I don't really know about, but the air target was a long windsock-like thing that would be longer than this room, I would guess. Much longer than this room. And it was like a long windsock, and at the top end of it there were a bunch of smaller pieces that went up to a latch that held it. And it was pulled on the end of a long cable behind a little airplane called a Lysander. Now, these Lysanders were cute little airplanes. They had a top wing, and these particular ones were all painted orange and black stripes. I guess that made them very visible and different from the other planes. And they'd pull this cable with this drogue, that was what it was called, behind it. And away they'd go. They'd get up in the air, and then they'd let their cable out, and then they'd let the drogue out, and when it got to the end of the cable, it would stop, and it would flutter, and it would open up, and there it would be, the target. And then along comes the plane that's supposed to shoot. Now, the planes that carried the gunners were called ferry battles. Now, some of these ferry battles, I think, had been in the Battle of Britain, because they were still painted camouflage colors, and some of them had bullet holes in them. So they'd been in action someplace. And I believe that they had 2 people in them, a pilot and a gunner, at least for training purposes. That's my memory. Now, my memory may not be perfect, but this is what I remember. And they would follow the target around, and the gunner in the turret, he'd be trying to shoot at the drogue. And I think, too, that there were cannon in the front of the wings of the ferry battles, and they would also try to shoot the drogue. I'm not 100% certain about that, but I think they did, too. And they would fly all around, you know, within maybe a 5-mile radius of the airport. And God knows where these bullets fell. I never heard of anything being hurt. I do know some funny thing that they had so many belts of ammunition that they were required to shoot, and I guess if they didn't get done in time for them to go in again, they dumped them over the edge, and occasionally belts of ammo would be found in fields. But then at the end of that period of shooting, then that plane would go and land and get a new crew, I guess, but the Lysander wouldn't. It would come back to a corner of the airport, which was closest to where we were walking to school, and there was a little hut there, and they were supposed to drop that drogue close to the hut. And there was a windsock there to show them how much wind was blowing or whatever, and the ideal thing was to drop that close to the hut, and the guys that were in the hut would run out and catch it. Well, sometimes that happened, and sometimes it didn't, because the wind would be blowing and it would drift off someplace, and if it drifted off the Air Force land, it was fair game, and we would run to try to catch them. And it was a prize, because if you caught one and rolled it up and took it to the gate, you got $1.25, which was a lot of money in those days. You know, because Army guys got paid, what, $1 a day or something? $1.10 a day. So that was a fair bit of money. So it was a real prize to get one. And I remember my mom and dad kept one, which was probably verboten. And they used the material, it didn't have many holes in it, and they used the material for various things. I think my mom made a skirt out of one. Some of them were canvas, and the newer ones were made of very heavy nylon, and they were all white colored. Now when those drogues were dropped and caught, then it was the job of the men that were at the hut to take a colored stamp and stamp every bullet hole and count them, so they would know how many times that particular that particular gunner had hit the target. And then they would reuse the drogue, of course, and the holes were marked, so the next holes would not be marked, right? But another interesting thing might happen, because how they got that drogue off was to send another drogue down the cable, clink, and it was supposed to knock the first one off. But sometimes it didn't. And the plane would be flying around with two drogues, fluttering in the breeze like this, trying to get this mess cleaned up. And so, you know, sometimes they would end up flying with the two darn drogues, and sometimes they'd lose one someplace, you know. So that was kind of a fun part of the gunnery part for us. You know, it was fun to watch all this stuff. And then the bombing aspect of it, the bombing was done over a marshy eastern portion of Lake Dauphin. They had targets set up, and we never saw those. Those were not areas where civilians would go, but we would see the bombing, we would hear the bombing, and we'd see the flash. It was smoke bombs that had a flash, and then we'd hear the sound. You know, sometimes at night we'd look across the lake, and you'd see the flash, and then you'd hear the sound. That was my first experience with sound delay. You know, and we had a bomb in our house. I don't know how we came by it. They were about this long, and they unscrewed, and the detonator was in the front end of it.
And the bomb you had was safe?
I don't know. My dad and his friends, they were, you know, they were young men too. You have to remember that they weren't old guys. They'd be out for the fun they could have too. And the bombers that were used were Bolingbroke's. They were a twin-engine plane. And is there a Bolingbroke up at the museum? Yeah. Okay. And there's a ferry battle there too. And other planes that we saw there were Ansons and Harvards and Cessnas. And I don't know what reason they were there. They might have been there just for observation, you know, by other personnel. They may have flown in from other airports, like number 10, where they use a lot of Harvards and Ansons.
Maybe explain, Marie, that there was another school.
Yes.
In
Mm-hmm.
and it was what?
It was, I think it was an advanced, not a basic training. I think it was a more advanced flying school. And they used Harvards mostly, and I think they used Ansons for teaching navigation at that field. And these fields were built on the prairies because we had lots of sunshine, no mountains in the way, and yeah, I guess basically good weather, flat land.
So there were a lot of planes in the air.
Oh my gosh, yes, all the time, day and night, because they did night bombing over the lake. And there were lots of things to see too around the activities of the airplanes. Like we would watch them take off, and we'd walking to and from school, we'd say, well, I bet that one's going to take off on that one way because the wind is facing this way or that way. You know, we learned some things about how airplanes operated, and we saw some things that were sometimes exciting and sometimes scary, because one of the runways came right over where we'd be walking to school. It was the east-west runway, and runways are generally built in a triangular way to catch, you know, the best wind, whichever the wind was that day. But a lot of them landed and took off east and west, and we'd be right under them, and they would not be very far up by the time they got to the edge of the fence, you know. And sometimes in the winter time, the wheels would freeze in. The landing gear would not come down. And the ferry battles had a landing gear that extended out of the body like this. And the Harvards had a landing gear the wheels looked like a couple of buttons on their belly. They folded up like this. And sometimes they would freeze. And sometimes they'd get one down. And then you'd see them flying all over, tipping the plane this way and that way to try and get, like this, to try and shake the other wheel out, or a wheel, any wheel out, And sometimes they would land with one wheel, and we'd see that, and they'd come down and they'd stay on the level till they slowed down, and then they'd go off like that, and then the fire truck and the ambulance would be there, zippity-doo-dah, And sometimes they'd belly flop. And to me, it looked like the belly flop was safer because they would just come in, and do this. One time there was a crash that landed in the bush south of the airport. And I don't know whether there was just injuries or whether there's a fatality there, but I know that we kids were told that we mustn't go there, but we did. After it was cleaned up, and we did see blood there. And the plane was kind of mangled and hung up in the trees. And it was a ferry battle, I think.
Did they ever clean those wreckages up, or did they stay there for years and years and years afterwards?
Well, the one in the bush was taken away. But the ones on the runway, they would be taken in and fixed up and used. I mean, they didn't have that many airplanes to spare, Yeah.
Were you ever worried?
About the pilots?
Well, about crashes and your proximity to the planes as they were going over?
No.
To the bombs?
No.
No?
No, it was all a big adventure. That's a child's eye view. It was an adventure. And we would sometimes worry about the pilots if they get hurt, or the crew. But it wasn't a worrisome thing to us. The only worrisome thing for us later as the war progressed had to do with the danger of invasion. While that seemed remote, I remember seeing when we went to the movies in those days, there was always a newsreel. That's like television news. And of course, a lot of it was propaganda too. As I recognize that now. But they did. I remember one that really impressed me, because at that time Germany had overrun Scandinavia and all of Europe. And they said, well, the next base would be Iceland, and then Greenland, and the next one would be Canada. So that was the first time the reality hit home for me that, hey, there was a possibility that bad things could happen. And at that time, submarines were in the St. Lawrence River, so it was coming closer. And yet, we were a long way away. But we had to bring news to school in the morning, how kids still do, current events, and we would be listening for war news and sinking of ships and bombings.
Did instruction at school involve discussion of the war and what you would do in that situation if ever you should be in danger?
No. It was mostly reporting current events. And school changed too. Because some of the air crew, the Canadians, brought some of their families to live in any kind of accommodation they could find. And because we lived by Lake Dauphin, there were a lot of summer homes there. And a lot of fellows were lucky enough to be able to bring their families. And so the school population fluctuated. They might be there for 3 or 4 months, a bunch of kids, and then they'd leave again. But another aspect of this for me had to do with, well, this was a couple of years later, I guess, because I was only 10 when the war started. But when I was 12 and 13, I was able to start babysitting for some of these families. And that was a whole new world for me, because as I said, the world came to our door, and they were different people than we were, in a sense that some of them were urban. They lived in different parts of the country. They were young families that had I guess I need to say a little parenthesis here that the family I grew up in was not a joyous family. My parents' marriage was not a good marriage. It was, they tolerated each other, and so there wasn't a whole lot of communication or fun went on in that family. So when I went to babysit for these people, there was a whole new world opened up for me. So personally, this was great to see other people, how they lived and how people loved each other and cared for their kids, and I think I learned how to look after children and how to love children. I love babies, and so this was really neat, and I got paid for it. So that was really neat. One really sad thing was that one of the little boys that I cared for, a taxi backed over him and killed him. Yeah.
At their home?
Yes, just outside their home, by the lake. Yeah.
Were there other ways that you contributed to the war effort? Did your family do anything in particular to help out, knitting or that kind of thing?
Oh yeah, we were all supposed to do that. Some of it was quite funny. At school we were supposed to knit. Some of that didn't turn out very well. Oh, and war bonds and war stamps, like you could buy a stamp for $1, and when you got enough you put them on, you had a $5 war certificate. And we children were encouraged to do that for sure. The teacher was the manager of that. Yeah.
Did the propaganda at the time lead you to believe that things were going well with the war? Did you worry about the outcome?
Sometimes we did, but I would say that generally our outlook was hopeful. But when you talk about propaganda, I recognize now how vicious it was. You know, that the Japanese in particular were portrayed as subhuman. And when I later heard that our soldiers were fraternizing with Japanese women, and I thought, how could they, you know? They didn't even seem like people to me. And I think about that now, I think, how horrid, you know? That's how and that's how propaganda works. It really works.
What about rationing?
Oh.
Was your diet affected?
Yeah, somewhat. But when you're on the farm, it isn't quite the same as city people. Meat was rationed, sugar was rationed, butter was rationed, and we had tickets. And we got, I think the sugar rationing was what affected us most because we don't grow sugar, but those were times when we preserved our fruit, and wild fruit like saskatoons and raspberries and whatnot was important for us to gather. And that was somewhat of a hardship. We tried to learn to preserve fruit with no sugar. And meat wasn't as big a problem for us, but when you went to the store and bought meat and you took a coupon in, if it didn't come out to the exact amount, they would give you a little token back. You know, if this meat was worth 2 coupons or a coupon and a half, 2.5 coupons or whatever, you would give them 3 coupons and you get 2 little tokens back for next time.
How much meat would you receive?
I don't remember. I don't remember how much. It wasn't severe in Canada like it was in Britain. And of course we had chickens and
your mother made your clothing?
yes, yeah, that was just part of how life was for most people. Yeah.
Did you go into Dauphin for events, recreation?
Regularly.
And would you
Yeah.
see servicemen in the streets of those times?
Oh yes, yes. The leaves, they had 24-hour leaves and 48s I would hear from the babysitters, you know, they'd get a 48 and they'd want to take some time off and I'd be the babysitter. But yeah, the guys were in town, so money would be spent in town. No, they didn't have a whole lot of money, but
So you'd see them on the side of
yeah.
the road. Were you ever leery of them?
No,
Always
no. We weren't taught to be afraid of people. You know, those were different times. Yeah, it was fun.
Any other stories come to mind?
Oh, one sort of gruesome thing, not gruesome, but yucky thing. And you'd never see this happen nowadays. Like the airport was about, at least the barracks were about 1.5 miles from the lake. And the sewerage ran down, it was downhill, I guess, from the airport to the lake. The raw sewage ran down the ditch from from the barracks to the lake.
That's a good thing, times.
Yes, it sure is. Yeah.
Oh, do you remember where you were when the war ended?
Yes. I remember where I was on VE Day. I was at home. It was a rainy day, and my mom was trying to wash clothes, and she was grumpy because it was raining. I remember a VJ Day. I was in Dauphin, because by then I was going to school in Dauphin. I wasn't living at home. I was living away from home. And we were in the middle of the street, and there were planes were flying low and dipping their wings, and big celebrations. I remember that day. Yeah.
And did life change immediately? The school would have disappeared,
Yeah.
not the buildings, but
Yeah.
the people would have left immediately. Did they?
Yes, I guess it wound down. But I think some of it were the landing strips were kept open for a long time. I don't know for what purpose. And number 10 is still used as a municipal airport, I believe, the one that's south of Dauphin, if I'm not mistaken. And there was did I mention this, that there was a third field built someplace in that area, and I think it was just emergency landing strips, and I can't remember where it was. Yeah, they left, but our lives had changed by then because there was more money flowing. The end of the war brought new hope for a lot of people. I know a lot of people were scared and thought there would be no jobs. That was in the immediate thought, but that wasn't the thought that was in my mind when I was 15 years old. You change a lot between 9 and 15. And I think there was an optimistic outlook for a lot of people.
Do you remember feeling relief at the time?
Not especially, because I never felt terribly under tension. I know some people did, and I didn't have any immediate family or many immediate friends overseas. I had an uncle overseas that I had never met, and I looked forward to meeting him when he came home. His only child was born after he left, and he met that son after he came home. Yeah.
And what did your father do after the war?
Well, he stayed working for the railway. He worked in the roundhouse in Dauphin. And we moved to Dauphin about 1946. Our family did. So that was some of our memories. I'll probably remember lots of them again tomorrow, but
Thanks for coming.
that was fun.
If
Thank
could
you.
call again,
Yeah.
some more.